This is Nigel Forster again for Photo Training for You. We're in a church in Crickhowell. Very brief demonstration of HDR, short for High Dynamic Range. Essentially HDR, and hopefully those of you can also listen to this as well, HDR is designed to compensate for the limitations that digital photography particularly has got for extremes of contrast. So when you've got very bright areas, extremely bright areas, but also very dark shadows, what you can do is to take several pictures, blend them into one, and get an average exposure, which takes the detail from the highlights and the detail from the shadows. Now, normally what you do is to take, say, 3, 5, maybe even 7 exposures, normally one stop apart, and merge them together. I use a program called Photomatix, which is the one that majority of people use. Usually most people find it better than the one that comes with Photoshop, because it's a specialist software program. So what we're going to do, churches are very good examples for doing this. Stained glass, very dark inside, as I know that Sam is finding, holding the camera still while focused on me. But also you've got light coming through stained glass windows. In themselves, the stained glass windows are very good subjects. What you would normally find here in one shot, the limitation would be you either expose for the stained glass and have the interior very, very dark, or you expose for the interior, but equally you blow out the detail on the stained glass windows. So what we're going to do is use HDR as a way of getting a single picture which balances the exposure between all of those. So I'm going to get a couple of guinea pigs now. We've got stained glass at either end of the church. So what I'm going to get one person to do is to point the camera this way, pointing at the stained glass towards the bottom end of the church, and somebody else pointing a camera towards the top end of the church. Before we set the cameras up, one thing to look out for as well is composition. What we've got here with both of these is very symmetrical composition. Ideally, camera placed right down the middle, unless it's something very deliberately off-center, that's fine. What you don't want is a little bit off-center, tends not to work. Think about the height you take the picture from. If you want to all come up here. If you take the picture from this height, then you'll notice the pews, I think that's what they're called, isn't it, are pointing towards the window. So it's a very dynamic, very strong composition. If you go low down, you all step down, then you can see you've got a different kind of composition where all the lines converge, but in a different way. And it focuses the eye much more on the light on the foreground. Likewise, do the same looking in this way as well. So you get very different composition. The light's just gone out, so somebody's got to go and wave their arms. You get a very different composition simply by standing up and going low down. What I would generally try and avoid is a composition where you're equal in height to a dominant line, because dominant horizontal lines running through a composition in a photograph rarely work. Don't want to talk about generalities, but that's the way it tends to be. So I would tend to either go high up or low down, so you get a converging perspective look about the composition. So what I want to do, if we set it up, where are you? Pam. Yeah. I'm going to set you up with this picture here, and I'm also going to set somebody else up with a picture looking the other way. It's a very noisy camera over there.
Yeah, why do you set it up then? Noise.
Lesson number 1.
Okay, let's get the composition right first. I would probably shoot this in portrait format as well. The emphasis of the picture is about verticality. Yeah. It's not same with you, Adair. Portrait format, because essentially the emphasis of the shape of the glass window, the line of there is more portrait. It's more of a verticality rather than horizontal, and you'll probably find you cutting the top off horizontal landscape format as well. Sure. I want you to take your first meter reading off the stained glass window. It's the brightest part of the picture. Use an aperture of about f8 to f10, gives you a mid-range. And what I want you to do is double the shutter speed each time, so each picture has got one stop more exposure. The best way of doing this as well is to use numbers which are multipliable or dividable by half. If you start using, for example, 1/5 of a second, you then go to a 2.5, 1 1/4, 5/8. So what you don't do is to use those. You do 8s, 4s, 2s, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. Makes life much, much easier. So what's your current shutter speed?
It was 2 seconds.
Right, go to 4, 8 and 15.
4, 8 and 15.
Yeah. Okay, what I've done is to set both our, don't want to call them guinea pigs, our student candidates here, different ends of the church. What I've got them to do is to expose firstly for the brightest part of the picture, which is the stained glass, and then gradually increase exposure by one stop at a time to gradually get images, a whole range of images, which we can then blend. The final one, the one with the longest shutter speed, being the one that exposes detail for shadows. So we've got a range of pictures for photographing for highlights and for shadows, with a whole range in the middle, which then if I put into Photomatix at the end, will blend to get an average exposure, an example of HDR photography. So we'll see what it looks like when we get them back to the studio. We're back again. What we're going to do is to process the pictures that we took in the church at Abergavenny with the workshop on Saturday through a program called Photomatix, which is the HDR program that majority of people use. Most people seem to find that it works better, myself included, seem to find it works better than the program contained within Photoshop. First thing I'm going to do is to just have a look at the raw files we've taken. We've taken 10 files. They're all taken one stop apart. Generally, that's recommended as the best way to ensure that you get the maximum dynamic range out of a photograph shot in HDR. Going to open them all up first. Right, here we go. They should all be identical. If they're not, they need to be. Just going to double check on them all, just to check they're actually all an identical composition. Does create a bit of difficulty for the program if they're not. The one thing that instantly I can notice on the pictures that have been taken, we've got a little bit of flare on the right hand side of the window. Even before I process them, I can actually tell that's going to be a problem. HDR as a process tends to, if anything, exaggerate the problem, particularly at the highlight level. If you notice, if you look at the darker ones, you haven't got the problem. These are the darker pictures taken for the stained glass window. Let me just pull the highlights back a shade. Yeah, we've got no blown highlights in that one. In fact, we don't even need the first picture. But the problem certainly is going to occur with the latter ones, where we've definitely got on the right-hand side of the window. I'll just show you again. We've got a bit of flare occurring on the right-hand side. So I am going to process it because that's what I'm here to do, but equally I know that this isn't going to work out 100%. I can only say that possibly the flare was caused by, I'm trying to remember what camera it was taken. I think it was taken on one of the Canons we had. Could have been a problem with perhaps dust on the lens, or perhaps the finger mark or something like that. So what I'm going to do, don't need to use, I'll use that one, don't need to use the first one. And in fact, that's probably not one stop apart at all. So I'm going to use the second one up and just pull the highlights back a bit, just in case there's anything blown out. Nothing really else to do with these. Give them a little bit of boost of clarity and vibrance. I normally work to about 20-25%. And go select all. Once you make the changes to one, it makes the changes to all the others. There's nothing else to do with these at all, really. So I'm going to include the first one, but when it comes to processing it, I'm not going to bother loading it into Photomatix. So we'll go to synchronize, and that'll make the changes I've made to the one. Go on. That's it. I'm going to make the changes to all the others. So if I go done, it takes them back into Photoshop. I've now got both programs open. If I go to load bracketed photographs, I'm not going to use the first one, am I? Let's go to the second one. Could have done these all together. To the lightest one, and can either open that box and drag them all in, or you can simply actually drag them into the space and it'll do it as well. So, and I'll go OK. This is where you've got various options. Removing ghosts shouldn't be needed. We've got the same picture taken on a tripod from the same viewpoint. So that's designed for pictures slightly out of sync, say handheld on burst or rapid fire, for example, where you've bracketed pictures but taken them very quickly. Ghosting is designed to improve that. Or, for example, where you've got moving clouds or moving parts of the picture. So we don't need that at the moment. Reduce noise, yeah, normally tick that because the HDR process in itself does give rise to image noise. And reduce chromatic aberrations. Again, you do find color fringing occurring quite readily on HDR, so I'm going to tick that as well. Apart from that, they are one stop apart, which should work okay. So it's now going through the process, and all you do now is to sit and wait. By the way, one thing to add, if I'd had one of them either not one stop apart or an inconsistent value, say one was one stop apart, one was 1.5, one was say 2/3 of a stop, the program would automatically alert you to this and ask you to choose which EV value we're going to choose. And it's got from third stop, 2/3, one stop increments. You can choose a variety, but it has to be consistent, and it'll ask you to correct that. By the way, other thing I should have pointed out, we had a bulb gone, which means we've got a bit of a gap on the right-hand side of the picture. So what have we got here? Well, this is the version in black and white. I've got a whole variety of options here. Uses two terms, tone mapping and exposure fusion. We've got a variety of choices here, and quite simply, initial stage, you really choose the one best suited to the result that you want, and then you've got the option of tweaking them afterwards. You can adjust the highlights, you can adjust the shadows. Let's have a look to see what we've got. You can see the flare problem, which I identified right at the outset. There's quite a bluish tinge to this as well, which obviously if we take it back into Photoshop afterwards, then we can adjust that blue tinge if we don't want it. And after that, it really is a question of personal preferences, of whether you want the subtle approach. They've changed this program slightly, this current version, to the absolutely god-awful over-processed HDR approach. If you look closely, there's quite a breakdown in the individual colors there. This is what's called image noise. But some people like these effects. I have to say they're not for me. Let's have a look through them. Try and go for the ones which we've lost a bit of detail in the window there. Right, now I've gone into full screen mode so we can see all the options available. It's already given us now quite a comprehensive set of different options. Now, for example, if I wanted to bring back the highlights slightly in the windows, then I could reduce the highlights a shade. I can do the same with the shadows. In that example, I've actually got a reasonably balanced exposure. In fact, probably mostly what I want to do is to make the picture generally lighter, and I can actually do that afterwards in post-processing in Photoshop. I can save it as a TIFF, then take the TIFF into Adobe Camera Raw and make the changes there. So if I was choosing this option, then I'd probably go for that. You probably notice that when we got the tripod set up, my student didn't quite set it up vertically, so we got a little bit of a tilt on it. So going through the presets, it really is down to personal preferences. Some of them, as I explained a minute ago, do work better than others. Black and white can often work out well. Slightly disappointed with the effect of the starburst on the lights. We took this, I think we were using about f9, f10. If you want a stronger starburst effect, go for a smaller aperture because you end up with more of a pinhole effect on the lens. So it tends to improve that effect. Well, which one am I going to choose? I can only choose one at a time, and then you have to go through the process again. So I'm going to, for argument's sake, move the histogram across. I was going to go for that one. There we go. I'm going to go for that one. So I think I've done all I need to it. I'm happy with the color. Just have a double check on these if there's anything you're not happy about. Happy with the color saturation. So I'm now going to go to process. You have to go to process because when you've got the options on the screen, it hasn't actually processed the image, and it's given me another opportunity to make any adjustments I want to. I'm going to leave it at that for the moment though. So I'm now going to go to save image. You can go to save image or save as. If you go to save image, it'll save it as on the folder that you've originally had the raw files on. If you go to save as, obviously you can save it to any folder. So if I now go back to Bridge, and I find my TIFF available for me to make any further changes I want to. That's a very basic processing of a simple image in Photomatix, an HDR image in Photomatix. We've taken, as I've shown you, a set of images from the darkest parts of the picture, exposing for the shadows, to the brightest parts, exposing for the highlights, and then blending them to create a single image. It's given you a series of options. As I explained, you can only use one of those at a time. If you want to have 2 or 3 of those options, you do have to go through the process again. You may wish to fine-tune the process of the image in Photoshop or Lightroom, whatever your preferred program is. For example, I showed you on this one, we could do with straightening it. It was slightly wonky. I would also want to pull back the highlights on the lights a little bit, because I think they're a little bit blown, and you've got a little bit of scope for doing that. We've lost the ability to process raw, but you've got some ability in the TIFF file to bring those highlights back a bit. I also identified there was a little bit of a color shift which needed correcting as well, but that's for another tutorial in Photoshop. So this is Nigel Forster. Hope this has been of assistance, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.